Okay, thanks a lot. You know, one thing you observe very quickly is that this isn't like the government conferences. You know, we don't come to hotels like this. So, but also the fire alarms don't go off on us very often. So, okay, there are a number of things I wanted to talk about this morning. And one had to do with, I wanted to thank Jack Holleran, the gentleman that just introduced us, because he put this track together. And the track is not the deep technical track. So if you're looking for the deep technical meaning behind things, we're not going to do that. We're going to look at, you know, a lot of the major issues that are going on, and we hope things that are going to affect you in the future. And what I call, you know, what Jeff Hunker talked about early this morning in the first talk is really full employment for people in the information security business. So I'm going to pick up on a few themes that I wanted to talk about, and then I'll turn it over to Will. We're going to try to leave time for discussion because we believe that's most important. That you'll see things that we're trying to talk about, but you probably have things on your mind, and that's what we'd like to know. So one of the first things, Jack said we're from NSA, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what the National Computer Security Center does. Does anybody in here know about the Orange Book or the Rainbow Series? Okay, you'll be happy to know I'm the last keeper of the Orange Book because we're moving to something new called a common criteria. And a common criteria is an evaluation criteria that is going to be used by a number of countries. Orange Book was for the U.S. The Europeans had their own approach to evaluating products. And so now we have a common approach. In fact, it's even turned into an ISO standard. So you're going to hear a lot more about this in the future, about evaluating firewalls and intrusion detection systems according to the new common criteria. One of the other major things we do is work on awareness. We're trying to make the country aware of the problems that you all know about. But it really isn't high on a lot of folks' agenda to talk about information security. If you just think about how long it took people to get excited about Y2K, and they're really only getting excited now that it's close to happening. Now, after, you know, Y2K goes away, and it will, then we're going to be pushing very hard on critical infrastructure protection. We also put on a conference each year. It's called the National Information System Security Conference, and some of you probably have been there. We used to have it in Baltimore for many years. We moved down to Crystal City for the last, and for this year again, but certainly we welcome you all there. And we have in the past endorsed products. That is, they got a rating according to the Orange Book. They got a C2 rating. You know, Windows NT had achieved a C2 rating. Whether you liked Windows NT or not, it had gone through that process. And so, we were out working with the commercial industry to get products evaluated. So at least you have a baseline to know what it is that the products will and won't do. Now, what's this track about? Yeah. Pardon? Yeah.
Where is the conference going to be held?
Oh, the conference is going to be held in Crystal City. It's in the Washington area, right by National Airport. So it's fairly easy to get to. We do have brochures upstairs in the booth called the NIAP, the National Information Assurance Partnership. We have brochures on that. Thank you for asking. We appreciate that. Okay, this white hat track, we wanted to talk about issues that we think are important. You heard Jeff Hunker talk about the critical plan, the national plan that we're working on. But there are a lot of issues that are important that the private sector needs to be involved with the government in protecting the infrastructure. We want to help you manage your information assets securely. And of course, one of the obvious things is there is no technical solution, no one technical solution to the problem. You don't go and tell your boss, I'm going to put in a firewall, and then I'm going to have intrusion detection devices, and then we're going to have security in the applications. It's not that simple, because it turns out most of the problems come from people that you work with, what we call the insiders. Probably 70–80% of the problems that people see in surveys say insiders are still causing you most of the problems. So a lot of it is a social problem, getting people to change their behavior, getting people that administer your system to do it right and turn on all the security switches. Now, we want to bring you face-to-face to that threat spectrum. And that threat spectrum runs all the way from the hackers that are attacking government web pages. You know, that's amusing, but it's not really serious to the infrastructure of the country. We want you to know that there are people out there, and Jeffrey Hunker talked about that this morning. There are people out there that really want to do damage to our infrastructures. We're not here to try to sell or endorse anybody's product. We want to know, we want you to look at the products and use them wisely. Now, as you look at the track and you see what's going on for the next 2 days, you'll see themes appearing. And the themes have to do with threats and vulnerability. Will's going to talk next about managing the risk. And that's what we all have to do. We have to accept risk. There is no perfect security. You can't guarantee your CIO that you're going to make the system secure, that nobody will get in. It doesn't work that way. You got to manage their expectations, and you got to manage the risk that you're working against. We're talking about risk assessment and risk modeling. We're going to talk about intrusion detection. We were going to talk more about standards and certification, but I gave you a little preview of that, and that was using the common criteria to evaluate products. NSA and NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, have gotten together to set up commercial laboratories to now evaluate products. Those laboratories will take in products. Maybe they'll take the next version of Windows NT and then give it a rating according to the common criteria. And that rating will be good to sell products in Europe, in Canada, in the U.S.
John?
Yes.
Laboratories are like the clefts in Europe?
Yeah, the laboratories are like the clefts in Europe, if you know the procedure that they were using. In the past, when we evaluated products in the U.S., we were using mainly the FFRDCs, the Federal Funded Research and Development Centers, and the government paid for the evaluation. Now, we're turning it over to the private sector because one of the complaints we had on evaluating products was we couldn't get them out fast enough. You take in a product that has 1 million lines of code, it's going to take a long time to go through it. And there were no automated techniques. So we've decided to turn it over to the private sector, and about 7 or 8 labs have already been approved to evaluate the products now. And then finally, we're going to talk about forensics. Now, it's not good enough if you just sit there and listen and absorb what we're trying to talk about. We need your participation in a number of ways. What we need to know by the questions you ask is, what are the key things that you find important? When you go back to work next week, what are the things you're going to have to deal with? So, bring those things up and see if we can't help throughout this track. We're trying to go from insurance, that is, we self-insure our systems now, to something we call assurance. And that will be, putting in the right architecture, the right products, putting everything together, and having the right policies in place. And we'd like you to challenge the speakers. Don't let them get away with things if you don't like what they're saying, because that makes for a better discourse. And most important is we'd like to do this track again next year, but we'd like to do it better, and the only way we can do it better is if you'll tell us what you like and what you don't like. And Jack there will in the red shirt, Jack, put up your hand, so the guy in the red shirt will take your comments on that. Now, every time a person from NSA speaks somewhere, somebody wants to talk about encryption. I don't do encryption policy. I know about encryption, we use encryption, but encryption is not the answer. And I think most of you would be aware of that. It's a very, very important part of a lot of things we have to do, but it's not going to protect us against a lot of things I've listed here. Denial of service, it doesn't matter if it's encrypted or not, they'll still take us out. So there are a lot of important things to worry about and don't focus on the encryption issue. Now, the security problem is not one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or three-dimensional. It's really an n-dimensional problem. I don't know if it's tractable or not. Some people say we will never get good enough security in the networks the way we're doing it today. We talk about having defense in depth. You want to protect the transmission paths, you want to protect the routers, you want to protect the applications. You have to protect it all along the way. It's not good enough for the firewall saying, okay, I'm going to put the firewalls in, and then I'll put this great new intrusion detection system in, and that'll really give me security. Because you've got to do all those things, and you've got to do them all right. Now, there are the thing that I call the composition of components. We've had this problem for a long time. If we evaluated products in the past, and all the products that we were going to put into a system had a C2 rating. We had a C2 firewall, a C2 intrusion detection system, C2 applications. We never were sure what we had when we summed them all up. It didn't guarantee us that we would have a C2 approved system. And so we still have this problem of the composition of components that we put in the system. We're still going to have it when we do the evaluation under common criteria. They'll get ratings that will be listed, they'll meet certain criteria, but when you start putting all these components together, you're still not sure about what it is, and that's an important research area. We have these interdependencies. I don't care how secure your system is if somebody shuts off your power to your building. That's an interdependency. Well, people say, oh, well, we'll have emergency power supplies. One of the things that we studied in the critical infrastructure protection was, in most cases, people have a couple days fuel supply for emergency generators. What happens if you can't get the fuel delivery? If they can't use the pumps to pump additional fuel? And we're studying interdependencies of the infrastructures. Okay, anybody that's been under attack wants to know the answer to the question, who is doing it and where are they coming from? Is it just another hacker that's, pinging away in my system? Is it Bill Cheswick up there just pinging away like he does every week? Or is it some cyber terrorist that's making a low-level reconnaissance run against a lot of systems? Or, as I pointed out earlier, it could be one of your own people, a disgruntled employee that's attacking your system, stealing data, trying to get even with you for something that didn't go right or some slight that occurred. And again, most of the time we found that attacks were made by your insider. So don't build your system on this hard perimeter and forget about that soft, chewy inside that you have to worry about. I wanted to say a word or two about these information sharing and analysis centers. An example of that, I think most of you know what Carnegie Mellon CERT is. That would be an example of an information sharing and an analysis center. What we are doing today is trying to get the different infrastructures together. For example, banking and finance is taking the lead. The bankers are going to get together They have hired a contractor, SAIC, to put together an information sharing and analysis center specifically for the bankers. Now, they may choose to only share the information with other people in the banking industry, or they may choose to make it anonymous, make the data anonymous, and then share some of it with the government. You know, it's surprising to me that a lot of people really don't want the government in their business. Anyway, if you're going to set up an information sharing and analysis center, you need to first establish trust. And that trust comes from working with people over a long period of time and giving out good data. You got to have service. When you're under attack, you can't wait for a long time. You need help immediately. And you need to know if other folks are under attack. We talked about sharing threat information. That is, the government sharing what it knows about the threats to the infrastructures. To the example I'm using is banking and finance. If some group of terrorists or criminals are planning to attack banks using certain methods and techniques, we would like to be able to share that information with the bankers. You always have to worry about viruses, the fraud and the theft, and also the economic espionage. Now, if those folks are any good, you're not even going to know they've been in your system. And so that's, one of the things you need to worry about. Okay, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and talk about what is one of the key problems that we think are facing us, and that has to do with getting more people in the information technology area that are knowledgeable about information security. This morning, Jeffrey Hunker talked about this thing called the Cyber Corps. Well, the Cyber Corps is being put together. It may not be called a Cyber Corps, it may be called something else, but that concept is there. But there are things we're doing today to try to help this. And a number of the things that I was going to point out, we have put together a national colloquium for information system security education. The first colloquium was sponsored by NSA. And we brought together the government, industry, and the academic community and said, we got to do something. We are all hurting. And the second conference was then held down at George Mason University. The third one, IBM picked up just this past May and held a conference at their center. Next year coming up, we're going to have the CHOW, the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office, sponsor it. But we've all recognized it's an important problem that we need to work with the universities so that we not only develop more folks that are going to be coming out as graduate students, but more people to do the research at the universities and more people to do the teaching of the people that are going to need to be trained. Okay, we have in this partnership with the academic community, we have set up some centers of excellence, and I'll show you which universities have been named as the centers of excellence. You probably know most of them, but there may be one or two on the list there you're familiar with. You have both Idaho State and University of Idaho. Those were two that had just come to the fore, and they're trying to, they're part of the centers of excellence there. A number of the others, everybody's probably familiar with Purdue and Iowa State and so on, and University of California, Davis. But those universities have already been named centers of excellence. There was a criteria that was set up. If the university was going to be part of this program, they would meet this criteria. And all this is on the website if anyone's interested in that. Issues that the universities brought up to us that we didn't think about in the time, had to do with setting up virtual universities so that they could train people without ever having to, you could get your master's or PhD without ever having to set foot on campuses. And they still have to work through a lot of issues on that. I didn't realize how the academic community was bound up in regulations probably as much as the government is. And then lastly, I wanted to give you a few of the university websites. We have listed, you have the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, of course, has set up a program recently. You have the usual ones, the Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech, Rutgers, and George Mason, in addition to the ones that I have previously talked about. So getting enough people trained in this profession is one of the top priorities, because we can propose to do a lot of the R&D, but if you don't have good quality people to do the R&D at the universities, we're not going to be very successful at it. And we need a lot of new ideas and a lot of new concepts here. Okay, let me just kind of summarize where I've been. I've gone over a lot of different topics. I wanted to talk about what we wanted from you. Keep that one in mind. We do need your participation. We need your feedback from this. I talked about issues that are related to critical infrastructure protection. And then lastly, I was trying to point out how important it is that we work with the universities and that we help develop the curriculums, the programs, and they get the support from industry so that when your boss says, I've got to have 6 more people to do vulnerability assessments of networks, you can find those people. The federal government is having that problem in spades, and so we're trying to take some initiative to move out in this area. So let me turn it over to Will Ozier now, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion.
Thank you, John. This is going to be a two-handed affair here, so I get to have Mike in one hand and a pointer, there we go, in the other. Thank you for inviting me, and let me talk a little bit about risk management. This is going to be kind of a high-level discussion, basically giving some articulation of the issues. When I was looking at risk for the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, first of all, 2 things. A, my name is not William, it's Will or Willis. So if you look in there and see William, it's not William Ozier, it's Will Ozier. And number 2, if you want to follow this, it's the last presentation in your book, so it's easy to find. You don't have to flip through a lot of pages to get there. And let me see if I can get a picture here. See what I'm doing would help. So while you're looking, I'll find the key on my computer here and get a picture. Hooray. Okay. We have light. I'm going to talk, gee, it'd be real nice if we didn't have that hotspot on the screen, but that's the way it is. How we approach this and background to it, some of the elements of risk profiles, how we articulated and illustrated risk so that the people in the commissioners and the President's Commission could get a grasp of, how things have evolved and how quickly and where the future might go if we don't get a handle on this. And apparently it was successful in getting their attention and beginning to get industry and government's attention as well. Risk scenarios, some critical numbers, just one quick illustration of some critical numbers and the issues and conclusions that we drew. When they called me in the first place, it had to do with one of the commissioners one of their companies had us do risk assessments for their environment, and it turned out to be an extremely valuable piece of work to them in managing their information technology and information security of that function. I'd like to point out that underlying all of this, we keep talking about cyber attack and that kind of human-oriented threat, but much of good information security is just plain good management. And so if you don't consider that management function, you're bound to have some of the vulnerabilities that will ultimately be a downfall for an organization or for an infrastructure. So what the approach we took actually turned out not to be something that we could do through tools because it was raised to the level of an abstraction at national policy level. So the idea was ultimately to illustrate risk. We looked at factors affecting approach, came up with risk profiles, and literally an illustration of risk by drawing from scenarios or parallels to scenarios where we didn't actually have a real one, and I'll explain that in a few minutes here. The idea, ultimately, and I was reminded of this 2 or 3 times in the course of it, and I guess I got the idea because they left me alone to do the issue, to do the report, and that was to produce a call to action, get people's attention. And I was really nervous because I was surrounded by all these PhDs, and I'm not one of those, at the President's Commission. And when I finally delivered first draft of the report, it was on a Friday. I figured that's a good day. It gives me 2 days, of respite, because when I come in, I'm going to get shot at big time. And so Monday morning I came in, ready, had my armor on, figure, okay, I'm going to get, hit all over the place for this. And Mr. Kurtz came out of his office way down at the other end of the hall, and this is a big man, colonel in the Army, and colonels are the guys that really get things done. They're the ones who make things happen face to face. And he stepped out of his office and said, Mr. Risk. Yeah? Compelling report. I said, yes. Okay. I had done my job. That was all I wanted to hear. From then on, it was just downhill because everything was fine. I made the point and illustrated the risk effectively. So, getting into a little bit of meat, risk elements, threats. When we talk about threats, and I'd like to remind people that threats are intangible. They sit out there lurking. A hurricane is a threat. A hacker is a threat. A nation-state cyber attack is a threat. All of these things lurk until they happen. Then it's a threat occurrence. Threat occurrence is what we're concerned about. We talked often about what happens if we have a cyber attack. We've never had one. Well, let's wait until we have one. I mean, that's been the process. If you look back through history, wait until you have the attack, wait until somebody fires the first bow and arrow, wait until somebody fires the first gun, wait until somebody fires the first missile. Well, actually, we didn't really fire any missiles at anybody, but we did drop an atom bomb. But, I think the Japanese government said, well, let's wait and see if it happens. Guess what? So, in this case, cyber attack, I don't think we can afford to wait and see if it happens. This is one time when if we wait and it happens, we could be hit by a cyber attack, and it's scary to think about, how little resource and how few people could actually launch an effective cyber attack. So the point being, there is a wide array of threats to be considered. Threat agents, in most cases, for human-oriented, we think about intent and motivation. I don't really care what their motivation is. All I care about is they launch it. I can't protect against their motivation, but I can protect against what they do, how they get there, their avenue of attack. I can put barriers out there, all kinds of safeguards and controls and management protocols. There's a capable population. And again, this applies to the human-oriented. This doesn't apply to natural disasters. But natural disasters are threats that can cause problems, and we'll talk to that in a minute. Do they have the means? Well, it wasn't very long ago that the means to launch an attack meant a substantial investment, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, the kind of investment it took a nation state, or at least somebody that was incredibly rich, to launch. And we now seem to have one of those with Osama bin Laden running around, waving his hand against, the ugly West. So, the means used to be a big issue. Nowadays, it's quite conceivable for any one of a rather large population to launch a cyber attack. All they need is a desktop, which they don't even have to buy. They could steal it or borrow it from a friend. They could be anywhere in the world as long as they've got a twisted pair and access, and launch a cyber attack. So the investment is peanuts, and I mean literally peanuts, not millions or billions of dollars to launch a cyber attack. And by the way, I don't know, how many people believe that? Well, those that don't, I have to tell you that everybody from the Belcor communications people, NSA people, associates and friends of mine who are involved, with dealing with telecommunications and cybersecurity, it's not a big deal. It could be done. So, risk elements: threats, frequency, impact, consequence, vulnerabilities. You can quantify some of these. You can quantify frequency. You can quantify impact and consequence. You can quantify the value of the information assets and the value of the supporting resources. You can do risk management, applying asset values, applying information value, applying frequency data for a variety of threats. And as we start establishing standards like generally accepted system security principles, British Standard 7799, and other authoritative sources for what are good controls, good practices and standards, as we start establishing those and gathering information through these ISACs, we can start establishing means of measuring, metrics. A couple of weeks ago, the insurance industry was represented at a conference in Arlington, Critical Infrastructure Protection, and the spokesman made it really clear the insurance industry is standing back because they don't have the metrics. They don't have the standards to measure against that we should be drafting and giving to the industry, from the industry. So they don't have any way of measuring what is the risk. They're in the business of making money. They're not in the business of giving it away. Their idea is like, what's the risk? What's the frequency? When it happens, how bad can it be? How often does it happen? Okay, annualize that. This is called actuarial stuff. So annualize it. Once it's annualized, okay, now we can expect a loss based on this kind of threat in this population of, $50,000 a year. Okay, this is taking a single company kind of situation. So in that case, well, we need to be able to cover an expected loss of $50,000 a year. Plus we need to administer this insurance policy. And we need to pay the agent his agent fees. And by the way, a little profit would be good. So maybe they charge $110,000 a year against a $50,000 a year risk in hopes of making, long-term money. But the idea is the insurance industry is in the business of making money. And that business is to identify risk, measure it, and administer the process of giving you some protection against what if that happens. So again, modeling this issue of risk for the PCCIP, Nancy Wong asked me, and I thought it was a brilliant idea that in hindsight to say, and this is based on about 2 years ago, let's look at a risk profile. What was it like 17 years ago now? How is it now? And how might it be 5 years from now if we just let things keep going the way they are and don't try to change the direction, raise the bar, improve information security in general? Well, 17 years ago, ARPANET was just beginning. 17 years ago, there was a handful of, quote, PCs, and they were pretty primitive. And there was very little connectivity. The only connectivity really was, within companies, hardwired networks of dumb terminals. And this goes on, there weren't any modems, there weren't a lot of the technology that we see today. Mainframe computers was the operating environment. Telecommunication streaming was in the thousands of bits, per second. So currently, we have, and I'll get to some real numbers here in a minute, but we have hundreds of millions of modems. We have, at least tens, if not hundreds of millions of desktop computers. We have connectivity that you saw the Cheswick's presentation. That would give a great idea of the connectivity, and that's exploding. That's not just the beginning. That's going to be going a lot further. So 5 years hence, if nothing happened, where would we be going? Well, we're not leaving it alone. We're doing something about it. And part of that is to actually begin managing risk. I want to go back to the threats a minute there hasn't been much talk about natural disasters, but there have been some serious natural disasters, and there will continue to be natural disasters that have significant impacts on the critical infrastructure. Let me back up a second. John mentioned how there are critical infrastructures, and then there are kind of super critical infrastructures like energy, electricity. And as he mentioned, many sites and organizations have UPS, uninterruptible power supply. But many of those are in cities where they say, okay, you can have 50 gallons of diesel fuel on site, or you can have, maybe 24 hours worth of diesel fuel on site, because they don't want to have big fires and have that fuel sitting there ready to burn. So that's great. You can run for a few hours, but if you have an infrastructure failure, like you said, the gas pumps don't work, so the trucks that would bring your fuel can't get to you, and that scenario goes on. But the whole point is that there are natural disasters that we're really not looking at. On the West Coast, we've done a lot to look at earthquakes, for example. But recently, as a result of the Kobe, the Loma Prieta, and the one in Los Angeles, we discovered that, well, we didn't, but the geologists and the people, the architectural engineers discovered that what was assumed to be good structural integrity for an 8.0 didn't cut it for 7.0. And that the infrastructure damage expected in the Los Angeles and Bay Area basins was upped by an order of magnitude from 10 to $20 billion impact to 100 to 100 plus billion dollar impact of a 7.0 plus located immediately in the Los Angeles area. The quake in Los Angeles was actually out in the hills, wasn't in Los Angeles. The quake in San Francisco was down near Santa Cruz, wasn't in San Francisco. The same events happen in those areas, damage and destruction will be far greater, not to mention the disruption of the economies and so on. In New York, there's not much awareness of it. There were half a dozen events between New York and Charleston of 7.2, as big as 7.2 earthquakes, 6.0 earthquakes. So in the 1800s, there were half a dozen of those. Many of you may have heard of the New Madrid event. Well, actually, it was a series of about 3 8.0 plus events around 1812. By the way, I came across this. A lot of you might have heard of the New Madrid event, fault, earthquake. 1812, rang church bells in Boston. When I asked the geologist in the local area about it, he mentioned the event of 1812, 1813. I thought, well, geez, didn't you know what day the church bells rang? It was like, such and such a day. Well, it was 3 events over a 3-month period of about 8.0, somewhere between 16 and 20, 7.0, and literally hundreds of 6.0. How many of you have ever been through an earthquake? How big? Anybody through 6 or 7? Okay, it's kind of interesting. 7.0s get really interesting. I rode through the San Francisco one with Loma Prieta, and even though it was like 80 miles away, epicenter, it's the first time it actually scared me. I thought, gee, am I really going to die here today? Because I was sitting in my 10th story office watching the wall crumble across me. Anyway, the point being, New York City has been the epicenter of several of earthquakes in the 1800s, around 6.0. What if that were to happen today? What would that do to our critical infrastructures, and our ability to communicate? Because a lot of banking and finance and other issues are centered there or in the immediate vicinity. Physical unintentional. PG&E, in cost management efforts, cut back on their maintenance for the long lines transmission. Where trees grow up and get close to the wires. So in the summer, I think it was 96, this maintenance program had the opportunity to go for a couple of years, and what happened? The lines sagged under heavy loading and heating conditions, shorted out against trees. That caused, the classic ripple effect of energy supply, and the next thing you know, the whole northwestern grid and up into Canada, was down with only little islands here and there of productivity. The estimated impact was something like $9 billion. That's not really a comprehensive assessment. It's basically business denial of service and that sort of issue. So physical and intentional happens. Physical intentional, now we're talking about bombs. We've got, experience with bombs, the World Trade Center. What if that had been at, like 55 Water Street? 55 Water Street happens to be a major switch, a major center for financial transactions, and we won't go into further than that, but anyway. So physical and intentional, we've got, hard experience of intentional physical. And what it can do potentially to the infrastructure is just a matter of taking that impact and superimposing it on, some key facilities that we depend very critically on, and not just here in the States, but globally. Unintentional cyber. You all remember the AT&T long-distance programming bug that propagated and shut down long distance for 8 or 9 hours, about 94, I believe it was? And there's been another 1 or 2 of those. A simple little programming bug, unintentional cyber error, but yet it had a ripple effect, on the information and communication infrastructure. Cyber intentional, well, okay, we can't say we've been subjected to a nation-state attack, although there was one from Southeast Asia to Ireland, which was kind of interesting, a little government-to-government hostility. But when we did this study, there was an average about 300 new viruses every month. Who can say that one or more of those new viruses wasn't intended to be, a catastrophic success, not failure, because of success of the virus? Now there are 600 average new viruses a month. 600, that's doubled in 2 years. We've had 3 viruses, big enough news to cause media attention for several days, to cause tens if not hundreds of thousands of individuals and laptops, desktops to be impaired at a rather substantial cost if you aggregate all the costs of everybody recovering their data. So cyber intentional, Y2K is coming up. What a perfect cover for a cyber attack. Everybody's already expecting there to be some ripples, some problems, maybe minor, maybe large. But again, remember, the cyber world has no geographic boundaries. If Russia's, computing environment collapses, and by the way, they said a number of months ago that, we really don't have any money, we're broke, and what the hell? Let's just see what happens, and we'll fix it. So what's that going to do with us? I don't know. We'll find out. So anyway, those are the categories of threats. Some of them, not as obvious, perhaps, but at a top level of how do you deal with it, those are the categorical issues of threat. I wanted to give some numbers. 15 years ago, PCs, a few, thousands. Now there's about 400 million, projected in a couple of years to be up over 500 million. LANs, thousands, 1.3 to 2.5 million. WANs, viruses, well, Robert Morris worm, had that worm been done today, people that are knowledgeable about that, say the impact would have been awesome and compared to what it was then, because we really didn't have the infrastructure, the internet really underway. That's only 6 or 7 years old in terms of real hardcore, huge structure. Modems, we had a few. About 32 million, pushing to 300, a tenfold increase, and we're well into that, and that's probably a low estimate. These 2 numbers at the bottom here, the skilled population set, in general, a skilled population of communications, telecommunications experts, the broad population of that is about 17 million going to about 19 million people. Now first of all, you all know about systems programmers, and telecommunications people, they're usually the kind of geeky people that are, in the back rooms, and they usually like to come in the off hours because they don't have to interact socially with the rest of the population, and they may be a little crazy, but we have to rely on them anyway because they're the only ones that know the internal guts of our operating environments. So we've got 17 to 19 million of those people. You take any population that large, and you're going to get the complete spectrum of, human disorientation. Within this population, there is a subpopulation who are extremely knowledgeable. These are the people that, that can do anything from anywhere. If you take this population, and not to mention, the kid hackers, the social outcasts, social misfits, terrorists, nation states, everyone else. There are literally pushing 20 million people, not counting the children, who are capable of designing and launching a successful cyber attack. It is a virtual certainty, if you look at probabilistic studies, that somebody in there is going to do it. And we're just beginning to get prepared for how to cope with that, even to detect it. Like John said, we're building the infrastructure, but it's not really in place. So, in conclusions, there is substantial risk out there from all scenarios. And these risks can cause shock waves throughout the infrastructure, and those shock waves won't stop on our borders, and they don't necessarily have to start on our borders to have an impact on us. So there are no boundaries, no geographical boundaries, period. Don't even think about it. When we talk about national information infrastructure, it isn't such. It's global information infrastructure. There's no way to put up, whoop, there's the shore, stop right there. There's the border between Canada, there's the border between Mexico and U.S. Stop right there. Doesn't happen. Control is decreasing in many ways. We've downsized, we've outsourced, we've bought off-the-shelf technology. So we're using Unix, we're using common platforms for the same controls. For example, SCADA in energy distribution and oil and gas pipeline management. We're using SCADA that are common software, common operating systems, and those SCADA, by the way, are linked for management efficiency and cost management and effective control. They're linked into the mainframe environments, in the mainframe, their general computing and communication environments. Guess what? Those become pathways of attacks to get to the SCADA. And as you saw from the networks and just how prolific and explosively growing those networks are, it wouldn't be very difficult for somebody that knows what they're doing to exploit those pathways and hit the energy distribution environment, hit banking and finance. So control is decreasing in many ways. This is something we got to do something about, and the approaches that are being addressed now, have recognized that problem. This drumbeat of increasingly disastrous events, okay, we haven't had a global cyber attack that we know of yet, but we've had, just in the past few months, 3 very significant viruses to impact the environment. At some point, if that keeps happening, it's going to get the media's real attention, it's going to get the population scared, and the national well-being of you and me and our families at home is going to become something that raises our level of anxiety, decreases our level of trust and confidence that we have an effective infrastructure. So the national sense of well-being is actually at risk. And bottom line, as I said, it was a compelling story, it is a compelling story, and that's why there is action being taken. Managing risk is the issue. Identify it, understand it, quantify it, manage it, trend it, and protect our national infrastructure and our national well-being. That's the basic issue for information security. Manage the risk. And I think we've done pretty much. So any questions for John or I? Way back in the back.
What did you base that set of statistics on, slide prior to this? Give me the active numbers.
The numbers, where did they come from?
They're recording the question.
Right. The question was, where did the numbers come from on the slide, on the previous slide, which, the number of the people, computers, desktops, modems, and so on. They came from a variety of sources. Actually, at the commission, I found I had an awesome array of tools available to me that I had never had before, such as the CIA, the FBI, NSA sources, IDC. So there was a wide variety of sources for that information and validating those numbers. So if anything, the numbers are conservative.
You're saying 10% of this country has the technical expertise expertise.
Those are global numbers, I'm sorry. Your question was, that 10% of the country has expertise. No, those numbers are global. Because it's a global issue. Anybody around the world could launch that attack. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Regarding, what you talk about is the elements of risk. One of the elements I was always taught in risk management was ownership of the resource, the data, the information stuff. How does, in the critical infrastructure protection, how do we determine ownership so that we can really look at, that risk management process that you've laid out?
Do you want to answer that?
Okay.
Who owns
Let me take it from an
that
infrastructure.
decision, when you're looking at managing the risks to the power, the communications,
Right.
whatever, is it going to be the individual companies, a
Okay.
bureaucrat somewhere? or
Yeah.
what?
Okay, let me see if I can paraphrase the question you're asking, is how do you assess the risk when, for example, the government doesn't own the electric power industry? There are hundreds of power companies in the country. The approach that we were taking when we had done the Presidential Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection said the government doesn't own most of these industries. It doesn't own the banking and finance. It doesn't own the power industry. It doesn't own your oil and gas pipelines. The approach to this, to managing the risk, was that it's got to be a shared responsibility between the government and the private sector, meaning the company. In this area or in California, you have Pacific Gas and Electric. Okay? They've got to do their part to harden their cyber systems.
But their threats may not be the same.
That's exactly correct. They are not going to be worried about some Iraqi, terrorist trying to attack the Pacific Gas and Electric. There comes a point where it is a national security problem. The first version of the plan is coming out. This is the first time we had to sit down and think through a lot of these problems that we're facing. When you look at telecommunication, a lot of things are happening there. The industry is being fragmented in many cases and consolidated in other cases, and the regulation has gone out of it. And redundancy has gone out of the systems. So when you go to a telephone company, to Bell Southwest or one of the Baby Bells, and say, look, you've got to make your system harder, they say, we're under a lot of competitive pressure. So that gets, I think, to the key point that you're asking about. What was happening in the world today, and especially in the U.S., was that the companies wanted to go with deregulation, which meant that they would not be able to charge. They'd have to cut down in many ways, and that meant they wouldn't be able to, pad the account so that they could put in the redundancies they had in the past. We haven't figured out exactly how we're going to solve that problem. The approach today is to try to make the companies aware of the problem. They need to do their part for sound business reasons. Right? You want to make sure that, some hackers can't get in and take down the power system in a major area. And we're not talking about a national threat. We're just talking about people that get in and play around and unintendedly take down a major power system. So the approach today is to try to do it by making people aware of the problem. We have the president standing up using the bully pulpit and saying, look, we got to do something about this. It is a national problem. You've got to do your part. And one of the approaches to that is to set up an advisory council to the president from CEOs of major companies on what the industry and the government will do together. It is a tough problem. Nobody's saying we're going to throw government money at this problem. That's not the right time for it.
Let me add to that for a second. So let me bring it down to corporate world frontline activity. there's been increasing recognition among information security practitioners in the audit community that it is essential for organizations to identify ownership of bodies of information and application. For example, in the banking industry, you know, who's the executive that owns the credit card business? Who's the executive that owns the loan business? House loans, unsecured loan, et cetera, et cetera. So who's the individual, the office that owns that information? That person then is responsible, is increasingly being made responsible for the security, integrity, confidentiality of that information. That's, you know, the continuity of the information. And part of that requirement is to also identify the value of the information. There's been an ongoing effort since that was initiated by the report Computers at Risk to develop generally accepted system security principles. There are a wide variety of, you know, of authoritative guidance in that regard, but it's being consolidated to say, look, there are some key issues, and among them is ownership and responsibility for the information. So it really gets down to, you know, the frontline management out in the field, and that gets aggregated upward within organizations, and from organizations is aggregated upward to critical infrastructure. But the bottom line is, who's responsible? You know, that guy, his office. If he fails to take, you know, to effectively manage that security, he may get away with it while he's in the office, but sooner or later, the person that's in that office is not going to get away with it, and the company is going to suffer loss. It may wind up being, you know, a trigger point for much broader loss.
We had a question.
Yeah.
So do you see this effort leading to something other than a touchy-feely set of standards? I mean, is it going to be something like these minimum requirements, and then it's going to be essentially enforced by the government, like a set of policies or something?
Repeat the question.
Okay. The question is this going to be like a kind of a touchy-feely set of standards, or something more concrete with government requirements or regulation? I don't think it's going to be... That's a hard question to answer, but I think at the outset there's going to be, you know, if the GASSP, Generally Accepted System Security Principles, or its equivalent is put into place, ultimately organizations, you know, by competitive means, and because they have increasingly electronic interface with each other, you know, they're going to be looking at each other and say, hey, are you secure enough? If I hook up to you, am I opening myself up to, you know, to attack or to vulnerabilities, you know, failure that would propagate through your system into mine? So I think there's going to be some degree of market pressure, you know, as this issue is increasingly recognized, and I think that management is going to be integrating into the management paradigm, you know, what are the tools that management uses to assure the integrity of their assets, their business activity, is risk management. You know, look at the controls, you know, are you in compliance with GASSP, with BS 7799, or whatever the standards could be. So I think there's going to be a combination of marketplace and perhaps regulatory pressure.
Let me just add one other thing on that. The common criteria that I spoke about earlier are pretty rigid standards. You know, you got to meet a fairly rigid criteria to get an evaluation under those. There are other standards that we're working on today, which would be standards for personnel, for companies. For example, you'd like to know that your system administrator had met some minimum standards, that they understand information security, that they have probably taken a few classes in that before you turn them loose on it. Another thing, when companies send out people to do red teaming or assessments, vulnerability assessments of somebody's network, you'd like to know they have met some minimum standards. Now, they may not be as hard and fast as you'd like to start, but they continually have this standards creep that goes along over the years. So, yeah.
Just on the last thing you said, is it really the standards of the system administrators you want to set? Shouldn't you set the standard for the management instead of treating the system administrator in a way so that it doesn't pick up on its every stage for the system administrators?
Oh, who would set the standards for system administrators?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is you want to set a standard for system administrators,
Right.
that they have to understand it for security. So, great. But isn't the real problem when you say 80% of fall into intentional racist comes from insiders. If they do, why are they disgruntled employees? They're probably not treated in a fair way. Or at least they feel that they are.
Well, let me approach that. Let me see if I understand what you were getting at on that, and taking the system administrator as an example. What we're doing in the Defense Department now is certifying or licensing system administrators. And they would have to meet certain minimum standards. I mean, if they're going to drive a Jeep, they have to get a license. If they're going to drive a network, we're going to make them meet minimum standards. Now, we can't do that in the private sector. We can only suggest to you that you set minimum standards. One of the minimum standards might be you might want to do a background check on your system administrator, because that can go a long way to making sure this guy is really worthy of the trust you're placing in him. After that, then educate him on what the right thing is to do. But first you got to have somebody you can trust, then you train them, and then you go on from there.
Hang on a second, so I want to add to that too, because you had mentioned, what about senior management, I believe. And the issue there is like, okay, the system administrator is effectively carrying out organizational policy at a higher level. Again, the GASSP and or whatever comes in terms of standards, at the top of that is a set of what we call pervasive principles, which were drawn from OECD information security principles, 9 principles. Okay, they're directed at the boardroom. And they say, you got to be, you got to do these things. You got to have accountability. You've got to have information integrity. You've got to have continuity, etc. So these kinds of factors are directed at board level decision making about assuring information.
Do we have time for one more?
One question, Brad.
Earlier, Jeffrey mentioned the need for a new crew, and you just mentioned the need for an advisory council. Hasn't the NESDAC and NSIE been consistent for quite some time already addressing those issues? And I don't think those people will be strong enough.
Okay. Paget raised the point that, why aren't we drawing on, or are we drawing on NSTAC, and what was the other one? Actually, we are. They are being drawn on. The recommendations they've made have been being paid attention to. They continue to be active. There's no requirement that their recommendations are acted upon, but I think they're being taken a lot more seriously today than they were just 2 years ago.
Yeah, we do have NSTAC involved, but that is only about 30 telecommunication companies, and we need to reach a much broader audience than just those a limited number. But they are involved in that. I think Jack said we're out of time here, but thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we'll be around if you're anybody.
That's what happens when they won't give you a cane.